BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
In the late summer of 1746, Adam Smith left Oxford and returned to his mother in Kirkcaldy. He found the country of his birth in a state of shock, reeling from the convulsive effects of the Jacobite rebellion of '45, which had culminated that April in the slaughter of the rebels by the forces of the Crown at the Battle of Culloden. The '45 cast a long shadow. To many, especially among the middling sort, it was a brutal and demoralising reminder of the fragility of polite society. For Adam Smith, it must have raised a still deeper question about the very basis of human sociability. How and under what conditions was it possible for people to live or flourish together? To these questions, Smith would soon start to develop his own magnificent and comprehensive answer. For the next 2 years, Smith lived at home with his mother. And about this time we know virtually nothing. Doubtless he continued to read voraciously and to think. But in 1748, Smith was invited to give a series of lectures in Edinburgh, and this offered an unmissable opportunity to gather his ideas together and make a public mark. The central topic, how to communicate effectively in writing and speech, was well chosen to appeal to an Edinburgh audience, to flatter Smith's interests and ability, and to prepare the way for a professorship, and a second series was added on jurisprudence. Both sets of lectures were well received, and they helped to make Smith's name. These lectures exemplify a blend of assumptions and concerns utterly characteristic of what has come to be called the Scottish Enlightenment. The idea of the Enlightenment remains contested among scholars, but by the turn of the 18th century it was becoming clear across Europe that a rapid evolution in thought was underway. In part, this was the result of scientific advance, but these achievements in turn betokened a much wider intellectual, social, and cultural realignment, away from religion, deference to institutions and received wisdom, and towards individual reason, scepticism, and the exchange of ideas. Scotland was fertile territory for these ideas, and the result, increasingly nurtured by societies, clubs, and coffee houses, was a remarkable outpouring of ideas and thinkers whose interests ranged from geology to law, medicine to chemistry, anthropology to the arts. And at its intellectual core, reflecting on the deepest workings of human nature and the social world, were Adam Smith and David Hume. It was probably around 1750 that Smith finally met David Hume and formed the most intellectually important friendship of his life. Hume had recovered from his disappointment at the public reception of the Treatise of Human Nature — he said it fell dead born from the press — to compose his Essays, Moral and Political, and he was about to write his History of England, published in 6 volumes over 1754 to 62, to tremendous critical and popular success, so much so that when his publisher then entreated him for another volume, Hume memorably replied, "I have 4 reasons for not writing. I am too old, too fat, too lazy, and too rich." In the winter of 1750 to 51, at the age of 27, Smith was elected Professor of Logic and Metaphysics at Glasgow. He arrived in Glasgow the following October, and was joined in due course by his mother and his cousin Janet Douglas, who kept house for him. He had agreed to take on some of the teaching duties of Thomas Craigie, the Professor of Moral Philosophy, who was ailing. Craigie died soon afterwards, however, and Smith, preferring both its subject matter and its income, was elected to the chair in moral philosophy in April 1752. By the end of his life, Smith would come to be regarded as the very image of the absent-minded professor. Lady Mary Cook recounted to her diary in February 1767 that, going to breakfast and falling into discourse, Mr. Smith took a piece of bread and butter, which, after he had rolled it round and round, he put into the teapot and poured the water upon it. Some time after, he poured it into a cup, and when he had tasted it, he said it was the worst tea he had ever met with. There are many other such tales. Yet the tag of absent-mindedness sits oddly alongside the fact that Smith was clearly an excellent teacher, both well organised and compelling in class. As the sheer range of his interests, from rhetoric to moral psychology to jurisprudence to political economy, testifies, the 1750s were a time of extraordinary intellectual productivity for Smith. Always prickly about protecting the priority of his own ideas, he expressed alarm at the possibility of plagiarism by others. According to his friend Dugald Stewart, Smith's response in 1755 was to present a paper to a local society, a pretty long enumeration of certain leading principles, both political and literary, to which he was anxious to establish his exclusive right. Among them were words that would carry through the ages. Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. All governments which thwart this natural course, which force things into another channel, or which endeavour to arrest the progress of society at a particular point, are unnatural, and to support themselves are obliged to be oppressive and tyrannical. This is the first statement of what would become Smith's system of natural liberty. It reminds us that Smith had conceived some of the leading ideas of his great published works almost from the very outset of his working life. Smith later remembered his 13 years at Glasgow as by far the most useful, and therefore as by far the happiest and most honourable period of my life. We know virtually nothing about any romantic attachments, for in such matters Smith was an all but closed book throughout his life. He was later described as having loved a lady in Fife, and, they may be the same person, as having been seriously in love with a Miss Campbell, a woman of as different dispositions and habits from his as possible. Intimacy apart, however, Smith had a wide and increasing circle of friends, correspondents, and admirers. And as his fame grew over time, busts of him could reportedly be bought in local bookshops. He was also elected to numerous clubs. They allowed him to see friends and enjoy the benefits of social intercourse without compromising the routine of his life or his unbending desire to work. And work he did. For during this period, despite all his other commitments, Smith somehow found time to write his first acknowledged masterpiece, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Theory of Moral Sentiments has laboured in recent times in the shadow of The Wealth of Nations. It is frequently treated as something of a problem child, an unsuccessful, youthful foray into moral philosophy soon to be overshadowed by the great works of Immanuel Kant. But the book is not, first and foremost, a work of moral philosophy. Rather, it is a work of moral psychology and sociology. Smith is addressing the psychological question of how our moral feelings arise in the first place. It is about how humans become human. The deceptively simple opening words show the way. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion. Compassion is thus a basic principle of human nature for Adam Smith. Yet it quickly becomes clear that the key idea here is not so much compassion in the sense of pity, but rather compassion as empathy or fellow feeling. In Smith's words, to judge of ourselves as we judge of others is the greatest exertion of candour and impartiality. In order to do this, we must look at ourselves with the same eyes with which we look at others. We must imagine ourselves not the actors, but the spectators of our own character and conduct. Robert Burns was a great admirer of Smith, and he picks up this theme in his poem To a Louse of 1786, in which he upbraids a louse for its impertinence in crawling on a young lady's bonnet. "Ye ugly, creepin', blastit wonner, detested, shunned by sant and sinner, how dare ye set your fit upon her, sae fine a lady? Gae somewhere else and seek your dinner on some poor body." Then turns to warn the lady herself, both of the impending attack and of the spectacle of herself she is creating. "Oh, Jeanie, dinna toss your head, and set your beauties a' abread. Ye little ken what cursed speed the blasties makin'. They winks and finger ends a dread are notice takin'." But the volta, the turn which gives the poem its further punch and meaning, comes in the last stanza, complete with a final anti-clerical flourish. "Oh, would some power the giftie gie us, to see ourselves as others see us. It would frae mony a blunder free us, and foolish notion. What airs and dress and gait would lay us, and even devotion." The words directly echo the theory of moral sentiments. For Burns, seeing ourselves as others see us can be a deflating and chastening experience. For Smith, its collective implications fall little short of revolution. If we saw ourselves in the light in which others see us, or in which they would see us if they knew all, a reformation would generally be unavoidable. We could not otherwise endure the sight. The theory of moral sentiments was a great success in its own right. But Smith made quite clear that it was also intended to be part of a much bigger project. At the very end of the book, he wrote, "I shall, in another discourse, endeavour to give an account of the general principles of law and government, and of the different revolutions they have undergone in the different ages and periods of society, not only in what concerns justice, but in what concerns police, that is, public administration, revenue and arms, and whatever else is the object of law." As we shall see, he spent the next 30 years seeking to discharge this promise. He failed in the attempt, but in failing, he composed the greatest work of social science ever written.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
It is one of the better what-ifs of history. In around 1726, the story goes, Margaret Smith took her son, Adam, then aged 3, to stay with his uncle, a few miles from the family home in Kirkcaldy, on the east coast of Scotland. There, in the words of his great 19th century biographer John Ray, the child was stolen by a passing band of gypsies, and for a time could not be found. But presently a gentleman arrived who had met a gypsy woman a few miles down the road, carrying a child that was crying piteously. Scouts were immediately dispatched, and they came upon the woman in Leslie Wood. As soon as she saw them, she threw her burden down and escaped, and the child was brought back to his mother. The tale has been endlessly retold ever since. In first recounting it, Smith's friend, the philosopher Dugald Stewart, acclaimed the rescue as preserving to the world a genius which was destined not only to extend the boundaries of science, but to enlighten and reform the commercial policy of Europe. But any resulting benefit was probably a mutual one, since Adam Smith was to amass a formidable reputation later in life for absent-mindedness. As Ray dryly remarked, he would have made, I fear, a poor gypsy. Adam Smith was born on or before the 5th of June 1723, like Isaac Newton, a posthumous child. His father, also Adam Smith, had died 5 months earlier, having worked his way up via public service and the law to be Controller of Customs in Kirkcaldy. In 1705, he became private secretary to the Earl of Loudon, one of 2 Secretaries of State for Scotland, in the tumultuous negotiations that preceded the Act of Union between England and Scotland. Adam Smith Sr. married twice. His first wife, Lilias, or Lily Drummond, came from a prominent Edinburgh family, and in 1709 they had a son, Hugh, half-brother to our Adam Smith. However, Lily died less than a decade later, leaving her husband a widower with a child. By this time, he had also taken the post of Controller of Customs in Kirkcaldy. It was a place of some substance and history, but by the time Adam Smith Sr. arrived in 1714, the local economy was in relative decline. The town did, however, have one enormous benefit. It introduced Smith to the formidable Margaret Douglas. Margaret married Adam Smith Sr. in 1720, but less than 3 years later, he was dead. His death must have been a shattering blow for the expectant mother and her young stepson Hugh, now twice orphaned. Little wonder, perhaps, that Margaret named Adam after his father. Little wonder that she and the boy were so close for the rest of their lives. Life was hard for the young mother. Adam was a sickly boy, and Hugh not a strong one, and at times there was very little money. In 1730, Margaret described herself as very much straitened. Money may have been tight, but Margaret evidently lavished love and attention on Adam. Writing A Short Life of Smith in 1793, shortly after his subject's death, Dugald Stewart remarked that she was blamed for treating him with an unlimited indulgence, but it produced no unfavourable effects on his temper or his dispositions, and he enjoyed the rare satisfaction of being able to repay her affection by every attention that filial gratitude could dictate during the long period of 60 years. Hugh was sent to a boarding school in Perth. Adam, however, went to the Borough School in Kirkcaldy, where he received a classical and religious education. For the young Smith, Kirkcaldy was undoubtedly something of an education in itself. Its market lay virtually on the family doorstep, but it was also an active international port. As such, it offered a wealth of potential insights into trade, especially so to one familiar with the customs house. The prevalence of smuggling in particular would have been obvious. Young Adam was not physically robust, but he was evidently a very good student, and he earned a reputation among his fellows as a genial figure. In October 1737, he went up to the University of Glasgow. The choice was a fateful one. For Scotland, Glasgow, and the University of Glasgow were all at that time in the process of rapid change to which Smith would make no small contribution. The Act of Union in 1707 between England and Scotland was highly contentious at the time. Adam Smith's early life was thus spent during a period of painful economic dislocation, adjustment, and uncertainty. Yet even as early as the 1720s, Glasgow was becoming a centre for the tobacco trade. By the 1750s, it was importing more tobacco than all the English ports combined, including London. For a mother like Margaret Smith, ambitious for her clever younger son, Glasgow was a glimpse of the future. Its university was a small academic community, less worldly, more collegiate and more intellectually austere than its Edinburgh counterpart. It suited Adam Smith perfectly. But when he arrived in 1737, at the age of 14, Glasgow University was itself emerging from a period of significant change. In 1726, the university began a rapid process of modernisation. Specialist professorships were established in logic and metaphysics, moral philosophy and natural philosophy. Smith studied these subjects as well as the ancient languages and authors and, of course, divinity. But his greatest early interest lay in natural philosophy. We should say the sciences today, and specifically in physics and mathematics. These subjects had been revolutionised after 1687 by Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica. The professor of mathematics at Glasgow, Robert Simpson, was a follower of Newton and an expert on the ancient Greek geometer Euclid. Still more important was Francis Hutcheson, professor of moral philosophy. His influence on Smith was both personal and intellectual, and many years afterwards, in 1787, Smith referred to his teacher as the never-to-be-forgotten Hutcheson. The basic question addressed by Hutcheson, of how humans know right from wrong, was fundamental to the very possibility of moral reflection. But it would receive a very different solution, and a far deeper, more elegant and intellectually fertile one from his pupil. The quality of Smith's work did not escape notice, and in 1739 he was awarded one of 2 prestigious Snell exhibitions to study at Balliol College, Oxford. He must have been struck by England's more developed agriculture and expanding industry, but he was very far from impressed by Oxford. The university had contrived to lose its medieval reputation for scholarship. The particular combination of slackness and expense did not endear Balliol to Smith, though it seems to have inspired his later view that the superiority of Scottish universities lay in the fact that their professors relied not on college stipends, but on income from fees paid by students, which made the professors harder working and more attentive to student needs. Even as they were, however, the college's own fees evidently hurt. In his first known letter to his guardian, William Smith, he complained about the extraordinary and most extravagant fees we are obliged to pay. It will be his own fault if anyone should endanger his health at Oxford by excessive study, our only business here being to go to prayers twice a day and to lecture twice a week. Oxford's lecture schedule may not have endangered Smith's health, but there were moments when he was far from well. He wrote to his mother in November 1743 that, "I am just recovered of a violent fit of laziness, which has confined me to my elbow chair these 3 months." Smith's condition is more likely to have been exhaustion or a mild form of depression than laziness. Yet if Oxford had its drawbacks, it also offered things to be grateful for. Many ambitious Scotsmen were self-conscious about their accents, and a certain English poise and polish were much sought after. One effect of Smith's time at Oxford was to knock the edges off his accent, so that, in Ray's words, Englishmen were struck with the pure and correct English he spoke in private conversation. Dugald Stewart also suggests that he devoted these years to English literature, to extending his knowledge of ancient authors, to learning some French and Italian, and to reading history. It was during this time that Smith laid the foundations of his mature thought, including the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations. There is one other fascinating possibility. The mathematician John Leslie wrote in a 1797 letter about Smith that "we have heard that the heads of college thought proper to visit his chamber, and finding him reading Hume's treatise, then recently published, the reverend inquisitors seized that heretical book and severely reprimanded the young philosopher." In religious terms, David Hume's treatise of human nature was dynamite. The University of Glasgow's Francis Hutcheson was among those appalled by its supposed heresies. But, though they disagreed over religion, Hutcheson and Hume shared a philosophical ambition: to produce a science of man, based on facts and human experience, which could sit without embarrassment alongside Newton's towering Principia. Hutcheson's attempt had been grounded on a divinely inspired moral sense, and on the theory of natural law rooted in the belief in God. But Hume turned in a very different direction, away from God and towards nature itself. A science of man, then, would combine core areas of human experience into a single, unified theory founded on a few simple propositions, without any reliance on supernatural powers or divine intervention. It was, and remains, a dazzling idea, with potentially revolutionary implications. The phrase "science of man" itself appears nowhere in the writings of Adam Smith, but the idea of it underlies and motivates all of his works. Smith's particular interest would focus on the possibility that such a general explanation could be given of human behaviour, public and private, from the home to the law court, and the legislature to the marketplace. It would not be until 1750 or so that Smith and Hume would finally meet, but their intellectual engagement would inspire, sustain, and provoke Smith for the rest of his life.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
In early 1760, Adam Smith was 36 years of age, unmarried, and still living in Glasgow with his mother and his cousin and housekeeper Janet Douglas. He was a respected university professor and the author of a highly successful first book. True, he was then temporarily in the grip of one of his regular illnesses, of cause unknown, but otherwise his life was a model of domestic serenity. In 1762, the University of Glasgow showed its appreciation of Smith by awarding him an honorary doctorate of laws. However, he was already the object of a highly tempting offer which would soon take him away from academic life. His friend, the philosopher David Hume, had ended a teasing letter of April 1759 by mentioning an interesting potential engagement. Charles Townshend, who passes for the cleverest fellow in England, is so taken with the performance, that is, the theory of moral sentiments, that he said he would put the Duke of Buccleuch under the author's care, and would endeavour to make it worth his while to accept of that charge. The Dukes of Buccleuch were some of the greatest landowners in Scotland. Townshend, later to achieve considerable notoriety as Chancellor of the Exchequer, had married into the family and become the stepfather of Henry Campbell Scott, the young Duke, then aged 12 and studying at Eton. Nothing immediate came of this, but 4 years later, in October 1763, Townshend approached Smith directly. The offer was a very handsome one: £500 a year to accompany and instruct his charge during a European tour. This was much more than Smith could expect to earn in a good year at Glasgow. In addition, on his return, he would be set up with a life pension sufficient to bring his intellectual work to conclusion. Smith swiftly accepted Townsend's offer, resigned his professorship, and assigned his remaining teaching elsewhere. He also, very honourably, insisted on repaying his students the fees they had paid for the remaining lectures. Smith and Buccleuch arrived in Paris in February 1764 and proceeded south to Toulouse, then the second city of France. In July, Smith reported despairingly to Hume that the progress we have made is not very great. The Duke is not acquainted with any Frenchman whatever. The life which I led in Glasgow was a pleasurable, dissipated life in comparison of that which I lead here at present. I have begun to write a book in order to pass away the time. We cannot know for sure, but it is fascinating to speculate that the wealth of nations may have been spawned by Smith's boredom in Toulouse. The tutor and his pupil finally arrived in the French capital at Christmas 1765. To be feted by the salons of Paris was joy enough, but it also introduced him to some of the greatest French minds of the time. Among them Turgot, the financier Necker, the social philosopher and notorious atheist Helvetius, the mathematician D'Alembert, and, most significantly, as it proved, the royal physician and political economist François Quesnay and his followers, later known as the physiocrats. Intellectually, this was an extraordinarily pregnant moment, and by implication, at least, the physiocrats offered a formidable challenge to Smith to test and develop his own ideas. The last months of the tour fell under something of a cloud. In August, the Duke fell ill, apparently of food poisoning, while hunting with Louis XV in the forest of Compiègne. Worse was to follow. The Duke's younger brother, Hugh Campbell Scott, had joined them earlier in Bordeaux. In mid-October, he suddenly sickened and died, despite the best efforts of Quesnay and of the esteemed doctor Théodore Tronchin, whom Smith had called in from Geneva. Smith and Buccleuch instantly cancelled their remaining plans and returned to Britain with the body. Smith never went abroad thereafter. The next 9 years were largely devoted to the reflection and research that would culminate in The Wealth of Nations. During this period, Smith took considerable pains to keep his work on an even keel and minimise interruptions. The one exception was for Buccleuch himself. The Duke was increasingly recognised as an innovative landowner, but his fortunes were gravely damaged in 1772 by the collapse of Douglas, Heron and Co., better known as the Ayr Bank, in which he and many other leading Scottish landowners had invested. There was a sharp recession in Scotland in 1771, causing many of its loans to turn sour, and lacking access to liquidity and capital, the whole structure came crashing down. The paramount need to save Buccleuch from disaster dragged Smith away from his work. There were other factors in play as well. Whether from overwork, stress, or loneliness, his health remained fragile. A letter from Hume in November 1772 implores him to finish the book and then settle in Edinburgh. Shortly afterwards, Smith headed to London. His main purpose was to get The Wealth of Nations finished and through the press. But there was one vastly larger public issue that was clearly absorbing him at this time, indeed transfixing much popular and political opinion across Britain. That was the possibility of war with the 13 American colonies. Smith was adept at turning recent events to intellectual advantage and using them to make political economy more immediately interesting and relevant. The Ayr Bank debacle featured prominently in The Wealth of Nations, but so too did the causes, course, and implications of the dispute with the colonies. During Smith's time in London, British relations with America accelerated towards war. In the next few years, colonial governments were overthrown and new state constitutions drafted. On the 4th of July 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. By then, however, the greatest early analysis of the deep causes of the American War had already been out for 4 months. The Wealth of Nations was published in London on the 9th of March 1776, in 2 rather expensive volumes and a print run of 500 to 750 copies. The sheer range, length, and brilliance of Smith's work render any summary inadequate. But the full title of the book gives a flavour of its contents: An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. This is not an economic textbook. Rather, it is a book about economic processes and economic development. Nations, it argues from a vast array of evidence, can be wealthy and prosperous, or poor and struggling. But national wealth is not merely circumstantial or divinely bequeathed. It is created by human hand. It is not a stock of currency or bullion, or indeed a stock of anything, but the annual produce of the land and labour of any nation. Moreover, what wealth really amounts to, and the causes of it, can be studied. Political economy can be used to evaluate policy choices, and such choices can create or destroy wealth. The book's panoramic sweep extends from the subsistence economy of the Scottish Highlands to the developed nations of Europe and colonial trade with the Indies, and from ancient civilizations to contemporary events. But nowhere are the effects of bad policy making better illustrated than in the discussion of America. The work itself has a clear structure, moving in Book 1 from the sources of wealth or opulence to the nature and uses of capital within an economy, Book 2, to the causes of economic progress and development, Book 3, to trade policy and its failure in Britain, Book 4, and finally to government revenues, taxation, and other domestic policy issues, Book 5. In effect, the first 2 books set out Smith's basic economic theory, while the last 3 apply the theory in different contexts, adumbrating en route his natural theory of liberty and its sometimes revolutionary implications. The Wealth of Nations is not merely a work of analysis, but a polemic against bad policy-making. Writing in 1780 to a Danish friend, Smith described the book as the very violent attack I had made upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain, and so it is. The thrust of the attack is both intellectual and practical. Great Britain had done more than any nation to spread trade around the world, but in doing so, it had helped to spawn a body of mercantilist practices that, far from enriching the country, were actively undermining it. For Smith, the mercantile system is marked by its obsession with money. The domestic effects of mercantilism were highly damaging, for every export bounty or restraint on imports was, in effect, a subsidy to producers at home. Mercantilism thus tended to distort trade and investment, boost profits, discourage competition, and indirectly raise prices. Worse, it fed the monopolising spirit of manufacturers and merchants, whom it taught to recognise that government action could increase their profits at little or no direct cost. Furthermore, Smith sees colonialism itself as intimately tied to the growth of the mercantile system. The idea of colonisation began as a route to the acquisition of mines and so bullion, but it broadened over time into a quest for sources of raw materials for, and captive demand for finished goods from the mother country, and into control of trade. It had even extended to include trade in slaves, which Smith roundly condemns. The mercantile system and its flawed assumptions about trade and prosperity had thus lain at the root of Britain's imperial ambitions, so much so as to be a principal cause of the American war then underway. From a strictly commercial perspective, Smith found himself eclipsed by his friend Edward Gibbon, whose The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published the previous month, sold out almost immediately. Nevertheless, The Wealth of Nations did well. Smith must have known that it was by far the most comprehensive and acute analysis of its kind. But even so, he was grateful for the serious reviews of his book when they emerged, remarking dryly that "I have, upon the whole, been much less abused than I had reason to expect." Yet if Smith rejoiced in this acclaim, a much sadder note was sounded by his Scottish friends as well. While he had been working on The Wealth of Nations in London, David Hume, his inspiration, friend, and intellectual companion of a quarter century, had gone into a sharp physical decline.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
In retrospect, the signs of Hume's last illness may have appeared as early as September 1773, but they were well disguised. Adam Ferguson wrote to Smith then that Hume is in perfect good health. He had a cough and lost flesh soon after you went from home. He still has some less flesh than usual, which nobody regrets, but in point of health and spirits, I never saw him better. By early 1776, however, the disease, it may have been cancer of the bowel, had clearly taken hold. In February, Hume wrote in wry but mournful reproach, "By all accounts you intend to settle with us this spring, yet we hear no more of it. I weighed myself t'other day, and I have fallen 5 complete stones. If you delay much longer, I shall probably disappear altogether." Evidently in some distress at his friend's decline, Smith put the point pungently in a letter from Kirkcaldy on the 14th of August to his friend and former student Alexander Wedderburn. Poor David Hume is dying very fast, but with great cheerfulness and good humour, and with more real resignation to the necessary course of things than any whining Christian ever died with pretended resignation to the will of God. In their final exchange of letters on the 22nd and 23rd of August, both men opened and closed each letter in terms of the most touching love and friendship, terms which echoed each other, surely deliberately. Smith, my dearest friend. I ever am, my dearest friend, most affectionately yours. Hume, in what appears to be his last letter, my dearest friend. Adieu, my dearest friend. David Hume died on the 25th of August, 1776. As his doctor put it, in such a happy composure of mind that nothing could have made it better. In January 1778, at the prompting of the Duke of Buccleuch, Smith was appointed a commissioner on the Customs Board in Edinburgh. On the strength of his new income, he moved into Panmure House, just off the Canongate in a well-to-do part of the Old Town. Margaret Smith and Janet Douglas moved down from Kirkcaldy, and the 3 of them were soon joined by David Douglas, the 9-year-old son of Smith's cousin, Robert Douglas, and later his adopted heir. Smith spent the last 12 years of his life largely in Edinburgh. Though not an especially gregarious man, he clearly enjoyed life in the city. Among other things, he co-founded the Oyster Club with his friends Joseph Black, Hume's physician at the end, and James Hutton, the man who first established geology as a science. The club met on Friday nights in the Grassmarket. It was no seminary of debauch, since all three men were bachelors of austere personal habit, but it quickly attracted a clutch of Enlightenment literati. As Hutton's biographer, the mathematician John Playfair, recounted, round them was soon formed a knot of those who knew how to value the familiar and social converse of these illustrious men. This was doubtless true, too, of Smith's private Sunday night suppers at Panmure House, which became something of an Edinburgh institution. Nevertheless, there remained considerable work to be done, in particular in preparing a heavily revised new third edition of The Wealth of Nations. As Smith said to his publisher, William Strahan, "This edition will probably see me out, and I should therefore choose to leave it behind me as perfect as I can make it." But then, on the 23rd of May, Smith's mother died. On and off, mother and son had shared a house over nearly 61 years. Little wonder, then, that he was distraught. As he wrote to Strahan in June, "The final separation from a person who certainly loved me more than any other person ever did or ever will love me, and whom I certainly loved and respected more than I shall ever love or respect any other person, I cannot help feeling as a very heavy stroke upon me." It evidently took Smith some time to recover from the shock. But in November 1784, the third edition of The Wealth of Nations was finally published. The earlier editions had built Smith's reputation considerably, and the loss of the American colonies, scandals at the East India Company, escalating unrest in Ireland, and political upheaval at Westminster undoubtedly boosted public interest in what was increasingly being seen as a landmark in political economy. There were two more editions during Smith's lifetime, but neither made more than small changes. Those for the third edition, however, ran to some 24,000 words, including the index. The centrepiece was Smith's last and most vigorous attack on the mercantile system, much filled out by the evidence of statutes showing just how far Parliament itself had been co-opted by the merchants' interests. Smith was now at the height of his fame. It was reported that the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, as well as Henry Dundas, Lord Advocate of Scotland, had become converts to the system of natural liberty, and there was a distinct shift in parliamentary opinion. Pitt had read The Wealth of Nations and discussed its ideas with Smith, and while others deserved credit for the wider change of mood as well, the new administration's emphasis on liberalisation was evident. Despite his advancing age, Smith had not given up hope of completing the other great works that were forming themselves in his mind. But his priority was to issue a new and revised edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, as he had done with The Wealth of Nations. Smith's own health was now clearly deteriorating. He had been extremely diligent in his attendance at the Customs House, but after suffering through the winter with what was described as a chronic obstruction in his bowels, by early 1787 he had recovered enough to take a 6-month leave of absence, in which he travelled to London, in part for medical advice and treatment. He was treated by John Hunter, surgeon to the King, and made a partial recovery. Meanwhile, his work with the new edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments ground on. First published in 1759, the theory had been materially revised for its second edition in 1761, and had then run through 3 further editions without major changes. This 6th edition, however, was a different matter altogether. Smith had taken a 3rd leave of absence from the Customs House to make the necessary additions and corrections. But I am a very slow workman, who do and undo everything I write at least half a dozen of times before I can be tolerably pleased with it. The changes to the Wealth of Nations had been time-consuming but fairly straightforward. Those to the theory, however, were not just longer still, but much more intellectually demanding. As befitted nearly 3 decades of reading and reflection, they made important changes to the theory itself, and so required Smith to try to think through the whole thing once again. One of the editors of the authoritative Glasgow edition has described what resulted as almost a new book. Smith was now at that stage of life where death seems everywhere. His cousin and housekeeper, Janet Douglas, had passed away in the autumn of 1788. As with Hume, he admired her fortitude at the end. She seems to die with satisfaction and contentment, happy in the life that she has spent, and without the slightest fear or anxiety about the change she expects so soon to undergo. But the mask slipped slightly as he testified to another friend of her importance to him. Her humour and raillery are the same as usual. She will leave me one of the most destitute and helpless men in Scotland. February 1790 saw the death of Smith's lifelong friend William Cullen, Professor of Medicine in Glasgow and later Edinburgh. Writing to his son, Smith apologised in abject terms for his inability to attend the funeral. "A stomach complaint has weakened me so much that I can bear no fatigue, not even that of walking from my own house to the custom house." As late as May, he entertained hopes of a visit to London, but my progress to recovery is so very slow, and so often interrupted by violent relapses, that the probability of my being able to execute that journey becomes every day more doubtful. Nevertheless, he was, a friend noted, perfectly patient and resigned. In his declining years, Smith took care to leave life, as far as possible, on the right terms. In an age when nepotism was both common and expected, he regularly sought to advance the interests of younger friends and family with supportive letters and money. He also appears to have given away substantial sums privately, according to his friend Dugald Stewart, on a scale much beyond what might have been expected from his fortune, abiding by the maxim that anonymous donation is the most virtuous form of charity. Perhaps as a result, his final estate was small. Adam Smith died on Saturday the 17th of July, 1790, aged 67. His last recorded words, uttered to friends as he retired to bed before dinner a few days earlier, were, "I believe we must adjourn this meeting to some other place." He was buried 5 days later in the Canongate churchyard, under a plain stone listing his 2 great published works. Almost all his property and possessions, including his books, were left to his nephew and heir, David Douglas. In his final additions to the Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith wrote, "Happiness consists in tranquillity and enjoyment. Without tranquillity, there can be no enjoyment. And where there is perfect tranquillity, there is scarce anything which is not capable of amusing." He had the closest possible relationship of son to mother. He clearly adored Janet Douglas, and he was reliant on these 2 women for many decades. To a man who believed that the very suspicion of a fatherless world must be the most melancholy of all reflections, they were his source of tranquillity, and a precious and loving support. It was with that domestic support, over 4 decades, with Hume's friendship, and in the milieu of the Scottish Enlightenment, that Smith was able to complete 2 of the most intellectually significant and far-reaching books ever written, and to frame a body of ideas whose power, even today, is still to be fully appreciated.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The financial crash of 2007-2008 not only wiped out a vast amount of economic value, it wiped out much of the public credibility of economics itself. What is so striking about that crisis in retrospect is not the egregious self-enrichment of the previous decade, or the specific failures of policy, law and enforcement involved. It is the intellectual grip which the language of free markets held on almost all the parties concerned. The debate we need to have about what markets are and should be for, about the limitations of the idea of market failure, and the need to ensure effective competition, and about the norms and culture and the role of the state, has been left by the wayside. What is to be done? How can the benefits of markets be safeguarded and extended, and their ill effects contained? How can public trust be regained for markets and the market system? How can we protect this qualified but still priceless inheritance? We need a new master narrative for our times. For this, we must return to the dawn of our economic modernity and to Adam Smith himself. Not to Smith, the caricature one-note libertarian, alternately celebrated by his partisans and denounced by his detractors, but to what Smith actually thought. The real Smith was not a market fundamentalist, an economic libertarian, or a laissez-faire economist. He was not an advocate of selfishness, pro-rich, or a misogynist, or the founder of predatory capitalism. But he was a thinker of remarkable depth and power. For Smith, it is ultimately impossible to separate politics and economics from each other, or either from moral evaluation. A new narrative, then, must start with a new political economy. We can anticipate some of its substance, perhaps, by drawing out 6 lessons from Smith's thought. The first is that we must distinguish capitalism from commercial society. For Smith, the emergence of commercial society marks the historic transition from feudalism to what we now think of as economic modernity, a society of people trading freely with each other under law, inclusive of all and spreading wealth and opportunity to all, generating surpluses that can be used to protect the vulnerable, working with the grain of human instincts and human nature, and held together not by force, class, hierarchy, or rank, but by mutual moral and social obligation. Seen in this way, commercial society is an achievement of extraordinary value, which it is our duty to protect and enhance. However, if the preservation of commercial society requires the reform of capitalism, then reform it we must. Secondly, commercial societies need states that are resilient, modest, strategic, and strong. Amid Smith's concerns to relieve trade of the baleful effects of pettifogging regulation and subsidy, it is easy to forget the central importance of the state in his thought, as protector of the nation, adjudicator and enforcer of justice, treaty signatory, guarantor of trade, provider of public works, infrastructure and local schools, and, yes, as regulator of markets. Thirdly, successful commercial societies have strong states because they have the independent institutions and the pluralism to withstand the potential for state domination. Above all, they have the legitimacy, the consent, the culture, the trust required. But, fourth, commercial society has its own intrinsic weaknesses. The purpose of markets is to facilitate trade, to allocate goods, services and capital efficiently, to stimulate innovation and thereby to serve the best interests of the public. As Smith shows magnificently, in well-functioning markets, these different interests are generally aligned. But those interests can come apart when markets cease to function well, through a tendency to monopoly, through poor regulation, and more widely, through crony capitalism, a system in which businesses use political connections and influence to their own special advantage. These things undercut the core rationale for market exchange, that it should be what Smith sees in his system of natural liberty, a source of universal opulence, that is, of general prosperity, not the enrichment of a few. However, a fifth lesson is that crony capitalism is far from the only challenge facing modern commercial society. The deepest threats are those which directly affect the idea of human value itself. One is the commercialization of the public realm. Another is the impact of new technologies. The spread of social media also raises profound questions of public accountability and legitimacy. Adam Smith gives a powerful explanation of how we live in a world whose values are formed through human interaction. Vertically, through the disposition to admire the rich and powerful, and the potential inhibition by commercial society of sympathy, especially for the poor. And horizontally, through the tendency to compare ourselves with others, and our desire not only to be loved, but to be lovely. The apparently insatiable desire of the present age for social comparison and the status anxiety it creates are beautifully diagnosed by Smith. They sit at the heart of social media, to the increasing cost of young people in mental illness, and exploiting them is a core part of the rationale and business models of those media. From a Smithian perspective, the key questions are not merely about public accountability and the legitimate exercise of power. They are about who we conceive ourselves to be. A final lesson is that commercial society constantly evolves and constantly poses new challenges. Artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation are transforming the world of work. Globalization is drawing the most productive workers into countries that already enjoy the benefits of commercial society and threatening to impoverish those they leave behind. Even within the industrialized countries, there are sharp and increasing divergences of mortality and health between different regions and different groups. Commercial society itself, in the typically Western combination of capitalism and democracy, is under increasing ideological threat from models of state-first capitalism led by China. A new Smithian narrative must, therefore, take shape amid wrenching and divisive forces of change. Renewal must start with the intellect, with ideas. For economists, that means greater awareness of the nature and limitations of economics itself. There must also be social renewal. That means a degree of humility among those who exercise power, and a wider acceptance that success is often the result of where you start and what luck you have on the way. It means a Smithian focus on human dignity and human capabilities, and on how a well-functioning society can help all its members to flourish. But it also involves a shared recognition that there is a space that lies outside what is measurable or governed principally by law. That is the space of cultural values, of existing practices and habits, of reasonable social expectations, of what is done and not done. That space is under threat today, but a good society will find ways to defend that space of norms. Without it, all that counts is law and the dynamics of the marketplace, and these by themselves can never be enough. Finally, there must be political renewal. In effect, Smith's ideas pose challenges to the outer flanks of both the left and the right. to give up extreme aspirations and start to recreate a political middle ground, a shared sense of the common good, by engaging once more with the real, complex, messy issues of reforming capitalism and defending and developing the benefits of commercial society. Adam Smith himself belonged to no political party, and he is not the property of any one ideology or political movement. He preferred the local to the global. He despised faction and fanaticism in both politics and religion, and he excoriated the man of system who tries to control people and suppress human individuality and freedom. He repeatedly emphasized the importance of slow and gradual change and of reform over revolution. He was realistic about the importance of the state and about its weaknesses. In modern terms, he is neither libertarian, nor socialist, nor social democrat, but probably, on balance, a moderate, small-c conservative. Smith had harsh words on occasion for politicians, but his science of man is also part of the science of the statesman or legislator. Such a legislator will have a sense of civic purpose and a commitment to public service over private interest that allows them to be held to account for failure at personal cost. For Smith, a politician should be a philosopher in practice. Adam Smith was, at core, a philosopher. He believed in the workings of providence, of harmony, of order, but for him, human society, not divine revelation, rational intuition, or the individual will, is the ultimate source of our moral life. His whole emphasis is on communication and community, on what free people have in common. In his great project, his Humean science of man, mutual recognition generates social and moral norms that constantly evolve and proliferate, rise and fall, are superseded or survive. By this means, Smith opens the door to a potentially unified understanding of a vast range of human activity in all its glorious diversity. Premised as they are on free exchange, in commercial societies, these norms demand the same basic things of us all: awareness of others, courtesy, open-mindedness, consideration, tolerance, and respect. In the course of his life, Smith applied this core set of ideas again and again, refining it as he went. He took it from the basis of communication itself to the foundation of moral psychology, to the pursuit of scientific inquiry, to the administration of justice, to market exchange. Embedded in it all is a dynamic, future-oriented and ever-unfolding sense of human possibility. It is a colossal achievement, whose proper measure has still never been taken. Today, in a world of uncertainty, extremism, and misunderstanding, we need Adam Smith and the wisdom to follow his thought through in its full implications, now more than ever.